Hi, everyone, and welcome to Sustainability Explored, a podcast where every week we interview leading professionals, thought leaders, and overall disruptive minds in the field of sustainability to learn their views on the present and especially the future of the world through the prism of sustainable development. Today with us, we have Maurie Cohen, Professor of Sustainability Studies at the New Jersey Institute of Technology, co-founder and executive board member of the Sustainable Consumption Research and Action Initiative. This is an international knowledge network comprising academics, policymakers, and NGO representatives, working at the interface of material consumption, sustainable systems innovation, and economic transition. His books include The Future of Consumer Society, The Prospects of Sustainability in the New Economy. Another book is Putting Sustainability into Practice, Applications and Advances in Research on Sustainable Consumption. Yet another book is called Innovations in Sustainable Consumption, New Economics, Social Technical Transitions, and Social Practices, and Exploring Sustainable Consumption, Environmental Policy and the Social Sciences. We will be talking today about environmental and social science, sustainability science, and environmental policy. I hope we will learn a lot of interesting things today. So I'm looking forward to this very insightful conversation with Professor Maurie Cohen. Not to keep you all wondering for too long, let's dive deep into the sustainable consumption world and the world that is waiting to be discovered. I'm ready to welcome Professor Cohen in a second. Hi, Maurie. I'm super happy to welcome you on Sustainability Explored. Thank you so much for joining us today and for agreeing to share your wisdom on the subject of environmental and social policy. But before we dive deep into the subject, I'd like to ask you what brought you into sustainability. Did you have any personal attachment since childhood, or how did it happen?
It's an interesting sort of opportunity to reflect. It wasn't an obvious path that I've taken. I actually started out as an undergraduate in university studying business administration and marketing, and then moved to a graduate program in urban and regional planning. And my aspiration at the time was to become a New York City real estate developer. But by virtue of the training and exposure that I had in studying urban and regional planning, my eyes were opened in new ways to issues of social justice and environmental policy. I also became quite interested in sort of issues at the intersection between geography, economics, and urban and regional planning, and went on to receive a PhD in a field called regional science, which is kind of the quantitative tools of doing urban and regional planning. Through that, I developed an interest in what I thought of at the time as sort of peripheral and remote regions of the world. And I wrote a PhD dissertation on the social and economic impacts of the 1989 Exxon Valdez oil spill in Alaska. That was a formative and important experience in sort of understanding the intersection of social and environmental policy, technology, science, political controversies. So that was sort of the beginning of the beginning.
Right. So, and how does your professional life look like now? Now you are a professor at the university, right?
That's correct, yes.
What are you working on? How does it look?
So I've spent the last 20 years. I started out as an assistant professor of environmental and sustainability policy at the New Jersey Institute of Technology after spending several years in the UK. I was invited to join a new initiative when Oxford University was first trying to get itself organized about how it was going to take on board environmental and sustainability issues in a much more substantive way than it previously had been. I was a research fellow at something called the Oxford Center for Environment, Ethics and Society. That was sort of an opportunity to do a sort of second PhD on an independent study basis.
Right.
And it was an exciting and interesting time, especially in Europe. Sort of new modes of thinking about environmental issues were emerging. Climate change was beginning to become a more acknowledged issue. It was a formative time for the establishment of the field of environmental social science. So a recognition of the inextricable connections between the biophysical environment and social and political issues. And so I played a role in the early development of the field of environmental social science as it was coming together during the 1990s, and then came back in due course to the US, took up a faculty position at the New Jersey Institute of Technology. And like I said before, I've been here for 20 years and now serve in addition as the chair of a Department of Humanities. And I'm involved in a variety of other administrative curricular programs having to do with environmental and sustainability issues across the university.
I cannot help but think that you were one of the people in the forefront of the sustainability, so to say, revolution. I imagine there was no even such a notion, which is true, by the way. Yes, even the sustainability as a term only emerged in the 90s, 92, right? Rio and the Brundtland report. Are you happy about how things developed by now?
Well, no, you're absolutely right. So 1992 was the sort of birth year, so to speak, of sustainability. 1992 was the Rio Earth Conference, or Earth Summit. There was internationally a tremendous amount of enthusiasm and thinking at the time that perhaps the planet was going to begin to move in a decidedly different direction. Unfortunately, it didn't materialize in quite that way. So I was fortunately and fortuitously positioned during the early and mid 1990s to sort of follow up on many of the activities that were initially catalyzed in Rio, and especially around the issue of sustainable consumption. So there's a chapter of Agenda 21, which was the formative document produced in Rio, chapter 4 of Agenda 21 is devoted to this issue of consumption, especially in the affluent countries of the world. And it represented a sort of a remarkable moment in rather than attributing responsibility and blame to countries of the global South and to the sort of reproductive patterns of relatively poorer countries around the world. This was a moment where there was a new recognition that that's probably saying it too strong. There was a sort of an initial sense of awareness that that the true source of global environmental problems really emanated from the global north, from the richest countries of the world, and in particular, the consumption practices of relatively affluent consumers which were the source of demand for materials and energy utilization, which were at the heart of so many sources of environmental deterioration.
I noticed you have published at least 3 books on sustainable consumption.
Yeah, so it was sort of a bit of an accident of fortunate timing. Again, I was based in the UK during the mid-1990s and happened to be the recipient of one of the first research grants provided by a national funding council for work on sustainable consumption. And that eventually led to publication of one of the first books on the topic. A book that was put together with a colleague of mine at the time named Joseph Murphy. Book is called Exploring Sustainable Consumption, and it represented an initial effort to bring together sort of thinking about the consumption dimensions of environmental issues that we have tended to think about sources of environmental deterioration and whether it's climate change, biodiversity, toxicity in the environment, as problems of production. That these are issues that technical specialists in chemical engineering or in process engineering, industrial engineering are supposed to quote unquote solve, through the utilization of technological means and innovation, rather than looking at the consumption side and what's spurring the utilization of and the demand for highly consumptive, resource intensive lifestyles. So that's sort of the issue that I've been involved in trying to open up and to understand and to hopefully begin to devise some useful interventions.
Yeah, I am thinking now about supply and demand and what generates what really. Because when we are talking about sustainable consumption, I'm thinking, oh, it's, the blame is on the consumers. Why am I buying if I am not buying sustainably or over the limits of what I need? But at the same time, those who produce the stuff that we don't need, and they are responsible as well. What would be your, top 5 things that you could share from that research? Top 5 things of how to become a sustainable consumer, where to look, what to do.
Yeah, so that's an really excellent question. So thank you for that. And there is a powerful tendency, to attribute blame and responsibility to individual consumers, and to suggest that individual action by individual consumers will lead to necessary processes of social change. From my perspective, and I think this is an overwhelming finding of the research, is that these are not individualized and personalized issues, that it's the consumption system, if you will, that's designed purposefully by policymakers, by politically and economically influential industrial companies, by a relentless commitment to economic growth in material terms, that creates the conditions of highly consumptive lifestyles. And so in the field, we tend to make the distinction between weak sustainable consumption and strong sustainable consumption. Weak sustainable consumption are the kinds of initiatives that many of us are familiar with, about consuming greener or driving a more fuel efficient car, or making relatively modest adjustments in our purchasing practices that signal to others that we have some measure of environmental consciousness, and are part of a mentality that suggests that in order to lead a slightly different life, one first has to buy a lot of new stuff. So whether it's the new car or an energy efficient house or um, um, uh, uh,
Guilty as
clothing that is
charged. I just bought a new jogging leggings today because I'm planning to jog.
Yeah, well, that's so. You asked me about 5 points. Certainly one of them would be to be very skeptical of recommendations that one first has to buy new things in order to adopt a slightly different lifestyle. There's also a tremendous amount of emphasis on environmental improvement through emphasis on efficiency. And I like to tell my students that sustainability really has two sides of the same coin. One side is efficiency, and we certainly do need to focus importantly on productivity and how we utilize resources, and to do so with higher levels of efficiency. But on the other hand, there's also the issue of sufficiency, and that issue is very rarely incorporated into current considerations. I was just listening earlier today to the climate summit that President Biden has organized, and heads of state of quite a number of countries were speaking, participating, and for all of them, the intended pathway to reducing CO2 emissions and getting control of the climate change problem, is all focused on technology and technology improvement and more efficient technology. We still, so many years after Rio, have such a hard time talking about the absolute necessity of lifestyles, and how we begin to reorient national and global economies in ways that promote and facilitate good lives, flourishing lives, lives that enable high levels of well-being without necessarily encouraging ever greater volumes of material and resource consumption. So we've seen some changes on the margins, and we've seen the rise of some interest in sustainable consumption. But in terms of the world of elite policymaking, there's still a very, very long way to go. Progress has been decidedly slow, and time is short. It's a timely moment for people to begin to ask themselves, as well as to campaign for social and political changes that are consistent with a future that does not continue to perpetuate this notion that the good life is inherently connected to ever greater and larger volumes of material consumption.
Yeah.
Yes, there are people around the world who need to consume more, but there are others around the world who, have kind of bought into this myth that the bigger house, the better car, the more clothes, the bigger closet, is a pathway to happiness, satisfaction, well-being, prosperity. I think slowly we're seeing more and more people come to terms with the fact that there are other pursuits that are more legitimate satisfiers of a life of well-being and contentment and happiness and satisfaction. We don't have to destroy the planet. And so the fact that we're speaking to each other today on Earth Day is a timely and and um, um, great opportunity.
It's true. It's true. I was just thinking, you mentioned the overconsumption came from the global north, the US, Canada, Europe as well, a lot. But then the movement of zero waste and the minimalists also emerged in the US as a kind of a reverse movement. Like, guys, you don't need the bigger car and the bigger house. You can be happier with a lot less. Look what you're doing with your life. And that's interesting how it's spiraling probably. First it goes up towards bigger consumption, then it goes down to lesser consumption, and it's still happening in the same medium, in the same kind of environment, culturally, with the same people. And I think it's something to think about. You mentioned environmental policy, and I have a tricky question. I really don't know the answer. The policy should reflect the present, including the future a little bit. How does it happen? The writing of the policy, the issuing of the policy. Is it first the life pushes you to reflect on paper what has changed, or first the document is born to address how to do in the future?
Different countries have different, what we would think of as national policy styles. Countries of Northern Europe have multi-party political coalitions and traditions of a certain level of political responsiveness as they emerge out of society. Others have traditions and customs and practices that are more of a top-down variety. In a country like the United States that is large and diverse, we have a sort of long-standing idea in political science that local communities and individual states are sort of laboratories of policy innovation, and that ideas sort of start out in local communities or within individual states, and then over time scale up to a national level. And that's very much a process that was informed by the way in which environmental issues were taken up by the policy system during the 1970s and into the 1980s to some degree. The problem that we've had sort of since then is that there has been a kind of disconnect between sort of the pressures from below for innovation and policy action and the political system that wealthy and politically powerful institutions and other actors, specific regions of the country have exercised undue influence on the process. I think that that's been detrimental also to the global system. I mean, one thing that was that we heard in the climate summit that began today is a recognition of the importance of U.S. leadership on the global stage, and a acknowledgement and a satisfaction that the United States is kind of back and is now politically able and interested and has the capacity to again lead not only on climate but on a range of other social and environmental issues. But at the same time, we live in a world where economic competitiveness is a source of political power. and the United Nations system remains unfortunately weak and in many cases ineffectual. As long as burning carbon-based fuel is a source of political power and influence and contributes to military budgets and national prestige, it's going to be very, very difficult to mobilize a sufficient amount of political will in the United States, in China, in India. The reality is that when you begin looking at greenhouse gas emissions, it's a relatively small number of countries that's responsible for a disproportionate amount of total releases. And so it's not a question of mobilizing 200 countries around the world. It's a matter of getting about a dozen to be fully committed. But given the geopolitics of the current day, it will be an upward battle. And again, time is short. And this idea that we need to, devote time, energy, attention to revolutionary new technologies before we can take action, is really not supported by scientific evidence. We can begin to reduce CO2 emissions by upwards of 40% on the basis of off-the-shelf technology that's available today.
Right.
So it's really much more a matter of political will than it is of technological means and scientific capacity.
100%. What would you say is the key to a strong policy? Because if there is any power in the world to address those 5 to 10 countries responsible for the biggest amounts of greenhouse gases emissions, what this power should have, it's not one country dictating another, hey, do this, don't do that. What's the premise of the strong policy and really commitment?
Well, I may be a bit politically naive on this point, but I sort of subscribe to the idea that the role of governments is to improve people's lives, and that for at least in sort of dominant countries of the West, the prevailing philosophy of the past 40 or 50 years has been that government is incompetent, that it's incapable, that government should get out of the way of private interests and companies. That it's a matter of personal freedom, and it's about independence, and it's about autonomy, and that government has no constructive role to play in planning and anticipating the future. And that sort of brought us to the point that we're at today. I think what we see very much in the case of the Biden administration in the United States is one would like to hope, at least, sort of the end of this, what many people refer to as the neoliberal era, where government can get things done. It can attract capable, efficient, and effective people to work on public policy and in processes of civic engagement. I think we're seeing that in a number of other countries around the world as well. So, maybe we're turning a new page where the type of coordination and planning and facilitation of economic enterprise, of social progress, of creating the conditions for not just a small handful of people to experience and live lives of just extraordinary affluence, but to spread the benefits of social progress and economic advancement, much more broadly than we've seen, and create opportunities for really full participation and I mean that not just in the sense of individual countries, but truly on a global scale. Um, and you know, and create conditions that actually you know, lead to lives of that enable people to flourish in the true sense of the word. You know, not just in the economic and financial sense, but to lead lives that are worth living. You know, as opposed to just focusing on economic accumulation on the part of a few.
The most important is to be happy.
Happy is important, but you know, I like to focus on this notion of flourishing. You know, which probably, well, it translates into different language cultures in different ways. But certainly speaking in English as we are today, the word flourishing is not something that comes off the tongue very easily. It's not a word that's in common usage. We don't think of the conditions of our own lives as enabling opportunities to flourish. You know, we talk about children flourishing. We talk about the aspects of the natural world flourishing, and that's great. But I think we also need to sort of extrapolate those kinds of concepts much more widely and much more broadly.
Yeah, that's true. Thriving is a more frequent, let's say, term that I come across, but flourishing is something that I do agree with. That was a great conversation. I personally learned a lot. To wrap up this interview, I always ask my guests to provide one piece of advice for the listeners of Sustainability Explored. So what would be yours?
So I would encourage people not to sort of fall into this, what I would regard as a trap, that the path to a more sustainable future is paved exclusively with scientific and technological innovations. That environmental problems, whether climate change or any number of others, these are social problems, they're political problems, they're problems of how we've come to organize our economies and our industries and our educational systems and our healthcare systems. And at root, they really require social and political solutions. And that's difficult. It's hard. It's conflictive. It requires time, which we don't always have. But you know, unless we come up with a sort of a new social contract and a new set of political expectations and responsibilities, I'm afraid that all of the investment in wondrous and innovative technologies is not going to be sufficient.
Right. Thank you so much. You provided a wealth of wisdom, just as I expected. And it's a special episode. You're right. Today, on the Earth Day, we're releasing this forward-looking interview for the listeners. Thank you so much.
Delighted to have the opportunity to speak with you today.
Thank you. Goodbye. Thanks for being with us today and always, and for listening to this episode. This was episode number 87, season 8 of Sustainability Explored. If you like this episode, found it useful, going to implement any advice given by Professor Maurie Cohen, please let me or him know by LinkedIn. We would very much appreciate your feedback, and it will most certainly make us very, very happy. Subscribe to this podcast not to miss any new episodes. If you like the podcast in general, please leave a review, rate, comment on the platform you're listening on. We are available on 77, maybe even more platforms. So yeah, your review, your comments, your stars will help us become more visible and help people around the world to educate themselves on the matters of sustainability. Thank you once again for being with us today, for listening, and until next time, next Thursday. Take care, stay sustainable, and as it's the special Earth Day episode, love Earth today and always. Thank you. Bye-bye.